To say that Hawkman, absolute Hawkman, dominates absolute Superman, I don't even know if that's correct, man, because absolute Superman gets crushed, and it's not even close. Okay, so what this does is this picks up back in the 1940s, specifically the Nation of Kahndaq. And what you do is you pick up with Carter Hall, and he says, this is it, right? This is his mark. By God, we've actually found it. And he says the tomb of Teth Adam, undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. Unbelievable, right? I've never seen a vertical antechamber like this. They lined the walls of this well with King Teth's most treasured possessions. And that's where the other guy says, good Lord, if I'm reading these hieroglyphics correctly, some of these items must have been gifts from someplace else. And he says, that's impossible, right? Seemingly, it comes from Thanagar and the Thanagarians. Now, it's going to be a little wonky and a little interesting, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. And so he continues on. So the burial chamber's somewhere below us, right? And that's where Carter says, yes, but we must move carefully. Lazarus is paying us to catalog every inch of this tomb. And that's where he's told, you're right, Dr. Hall, and Lazarus pays well, but Berlin pays better. And this guy slashes the rope of Carter Hall. Now, at that point, you learn this guy's name is Bradford. And this is one of those times when I don't know who this guy is. The only Bradford that I know is Crime Doctor from the old Batman comics back in 1943. Technically, his name's Bradford Thorne, but I don't really know if these two guys are one and the same. I don't know, right? 1940s Batman versus this taking place in the 1940s. But even then, it doesn't really matter. Because at this point, Carter says, like, I never took you for a German fascist. Clearly, we have to edit out some words for the sake of YouTube's AI and their demonetization practices. But Bradford just tells him, never knew how much gold the buggers had, did I? Sorry, Carter, nothing personal, just stay out of my way. And he says, if the legends are true, the power in this tomb could change the course of the war, and there's no way I'm letting the Germans get their hands on this. And in fact, he continues on here, and he says, for a man who's seen so much of the world, you're rather ignorant of its workings. The way of the world was set in stone a long time ago. War is a foregone conclusion, and just because we're fighting that guy does not make us the good guys. So you hang in there, Dr. Hall. And that's where Hall's just like, oh my God, I am slipping. And in that moment, he grabs the mace unintentionally off the wall, just going to grab for something. And at that point, you pick up outside the well, and you've got Lazarus Corp here, right? They're like, oh, you know, there's screams and there's gunfire coming from the pit. But in that moment, Carter Hall appears, and they tell him, right? Put your hands in the air by order of the Peacemakers. This dig is property of Lazarus Holdings. And Carter just says, it's all right. I know what it looks like, boys, but trust me, I'm one of the good guys. But this is the crazy thing, because he emerges with the traditional mace of Hawkman and his artificial wings. But this flies in the face, no pun intended, of the whole idea of the Thanagarian mythos as we know it, because this guy is seemingly deriving his power from Black Adam. Now, he never says Shazam or anything like that, but remember, the absolute universe is shifting everything, so it's more theory than anything else. At that point, you pick up where the last issue ended, and absolute Superman's encounter with Hawkman. And Hawkman just asks him, right, did you hear me, kid? I said I'm one of the good guys. And he says, I'm here to help, and Lord knows you need it. And where he initially goes to introduce himself, absolute Superman just takes off, right, just disappears. And then he's like, where in the hell did that guy go? And then like, he comes back, and he's like, sorry, man, a door fell off a plane over Cleveland. And he's like, I'm Superman, right? I like your wings. What were you saying? And the guy's just like, I said, son, that you and I have a lot to talk about. I have been watching you, and I gotta say, you aren't. And then of course Superman takes off again, and he's like, are you kidding? And then he shows back up, and he's like, I'm sorry, man, I thought a guy was choking in Omaha, but it turns out he was just laughing really weird. Though matter of fact, we should probably postpone this conversation to another time, because I'm kind of busy. And that's where Hawkman goes to grab him, right, and says, don't do that again. Right? And where Superman tells him there are people in trouble out there, Hawkman actually responds in a pretty interesting way. He says there's always people in trouble. We are talking here. And that's where Superman asks, is that what we are doing? And Hawkman just says, I'm used to people listening when I speak. And Superman tells him, right, your grip, you're not from Earth, are you? And that's where Carter just tells him, born and raised in Gotham City before the place went to hell. I wouldn't be caught dead there these days. But then he removes his face and basically stops looking like Shredder. And he says, I am Dr. Carter Hall, archaeologist, retired. But back during the war, when I was flying around busting Germans, they called me Hawkman. And he says, it's the suit that's alien, made of something called nth metal, from the planet Thanagar. Never been there myself, but you're from somewhere out there, right? Have you ever heard of it? And Superman just asks, right, how did you know that? Who told you that I was an alien? And that's where Carter just says, you did, kid, just now. You got a lot to learn, new guy. Let's go for a walk. Now, this is the interesting thing here, because this is why I say it flies in the face of the mythos of Hawkman. There's seemingly no resurrections here, right? It's not as though Carter Hall is just kind of the newest iteration of Hawkman, reborn in a new form, you know, every time he dies or something along those lines. None of that's the case. He just took a weapon that seemingly came from Thanagar and has been using it ever since. So clearly it's prolonging his life and has various aspects to it that basically augment him and so on and so forth. And that's when you switch over to Christopher Smith, right? The Peacemakers. And he says, it's happening. They're bringing this stuff out now. And it looks like the feds who were seizing the assets, agents from Gates. And he says, affirmative, even the stuff from the vault. And of course, because he's talking to someone, but we don't hear what they say, he just asks the question, which crate? And he says, yes, I have eyes on it. And he says, a lot of armed guards. I'll need a full extraction team if you expect me. And then of course, ultimately he's cut off. And then he says, understand, as you wish, Lady Talia, Lazarus means forever. And at that point, he actually fires on the crate. He doesn't really kill the guys, but then something comes out and starts absorbing them. And so at that point, you switch back over to Carter Hall and Superman. Now, if you know what that is, please do not spoil it in the comments section. It's fairly obvious if you're familiar with the Superman mythos, but please do not spoil it. But at that point, Hawkman tells Superman, right, despite what everybody seems to think these days, freaking out like you're the second coming, you are not the first man who could fly. I wasn't either, and I've been at this a very long time, long enough to see twinkle-toed hotshots like you come and go. And that's where Superman asks, right, there are others, like me, with powers. And Hawkman says, man, there's others right now. Like, what are you talking about? Right? And he says, a bunch of you guys all showed up at the same time. You're telling me that this is some kind of a coincidence. The big bad out east, the witch in the west, some runaway from Project Olympus, whatever the hell it was that landed in Evergreen. Here's a funny thing about this. He doesn't say anything about Martian Manhunter. No one seems to know about Martian Manhunter outside of everybody in his own immediate vicinity. It's kind of cool. He hasn't been referenced by anyone, at least not that I remember. But at that point, Superman just says, I don't know who you're talking about. All I hear are the screams. And Hawkman tells him, yeah, guys like you are always the same. You pop up one day, all, hey mom, look what I can do. Convince yourself that you're special and unstoppable, and you figure why not change the world overnight? Iron Monroe, Wesley Dodds, Dr. Fate, Oliver Queen? And he asks him, do those names mean anything to you? And Superman just says no. And he asks, do you know why? And Superman says, because I'm from space. And Hawkman just says, because they were stupid. And he says, someone told me once the way of the world was set in stone a long time ago, and they were sure right. You cannot change anything overnight. You want to make a difference? You don't do it by basking in the spotlight like you have been doing. And where Superman asks him, like, are you talking about me? Like, what are you referring to? And Hawkman says, getting your picture taken all over the globe, saving a busload here, a plane full there. Do you think there will not be a response? And Superman's kind of flabbergasted, right? Like a response to saving people. And that's where Hawkman says, 80 years I have been at this. I've saved millions by now, probably billions. And not one of them knows my name because I did it the smart way. And Superman asks, what way was that? And you kind of get this flashback to the moment when Carter Hall had killed Bradford, literally smashed his head against the side of the well using the mace. And he says, I can show you, kid, those others, they wouldn't listen. And I don't want you to end up just like them. And he says, you're a rookie. Best to listen to the advice of somebody who's walked this beat for damn near a century. And so Superman asks, then what's your advice? And Hawkman tells him, for starters, you gotta let go of this feud with Lazarus. And he says, you've wounded them, but you cannot destroy a company that powerful. There's folks who will not allow it. powerful people, the kind of powerful people, trying to beat Lazarus Corp is suicide. Because lest we forget, Absolute Superman does not know about Absolute Joker. And neither Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, or any of those guys know about the Absolute Justice League. So there are forces at work out there that Superman has no understanding of. Ra's al Ghul, he was just the beginning. Right? It only gets deeper from there. And so that's where Hawkman tells him, you have to learn to work with Lazarus. And Superman asks him, right, like, work with Lazarus. The people who tortured me, brutalized my friends, who want to subjugate this planet, the people who tried to make me a mass murderer, why would I ever work with them? And Hawkman just says, I don't think you understand the bigger picture here, kid. And then he realizes, he's like, wait a minute, you're about to run off again, aren't you? And he says, Superman, you walk away from me now after I've stuck my neck out to come here, and we're gonna have a problem, both you and me. And that's where Superman just says, okay, Hawkman, I won't walk away from you, and just like flies away. And at that point, it pisses him off. But something that you're noticing here, this is not the Carter Hall that we are familiar with in the main DC universe. Yes, Carter Hall can be rough around the edges. Yes, he can be a bit of a dick. But the reality of Carter Hall is that at the end of the day, he's a guy you want in your corner. There's a reason why he's a part of the Justice Society of America. He's a stand-up guy. Don't misunderstand, if you piss him off, he'll break every bone in your body and think nothing of it. But for the most part, he's nothing like this. A guy who says, work with villains. Why? Because it's better to be the devil's right hand than in his path. Carter Hall in the main DC universe would never operate that way. And so at that point, you switch back over to Metropolis, specifically to the Daily Planet. And this is one of the things that I love about what Jason Aaron is doing with the Absolute Universe. When Lois shows up here, she's like, what the hell, right? There's no way this can be right. And this guy walks up and he's like, let me guess, you're lost. And he's like, you must be looking for the Daily Planet office. And she's like, yeah, I mean, am I crazy, or like, shouldn't this be it? And that's where this guy, clearly Perry White, tells her, in the tower across the street, the one with the shiny globe on top, you're about 20 years too late. That's not the Daily Planet anymore. And he says the old Daily Planet got turned into condos years ago. And I hear they're pretty nice. The newspaper office is on the 8th floor of this asbestos-filled rat hole, the one that looks like it's about to collapse. And he's like, good luck with the interview. And Lois asks him, right, like, how in the world did you know I was here for an interview? And he says, because I've read your work, Miss Lane, a bit more Faulkner than Hemingway for my taste, especially when you're talking about this Superman fella. But you'll wrestle the words into shape soon enough because you've got the goods. And that's where he introduces himself as Perry White. And he says editor on the Planet's Metro desk for 35 years, up until about 10 minutes ago. And he says, you know the story. Get rid of the grizzled old news hound who you have to pay a living wage so you can bring in some kid who will work for ramen money. The Planet was a grand old gal once upon a time. I love the way that Perry White is shown here. This is what I'm talking about. I love the way he looks, right? He's rough around the edges. He's not nearly the kind of kindly and understanding type of editor, almost like a very nice version of J. Jonah Jameson that we're used to, right, in DC Comics. Lord knows he predates Jameson by years, but the fact is, right, he says, now the Daily Planet is a Titanic. If the Titanic was a dump with a death trap elevator. And he says, this business will break your heart, kid. Good luck, Lois Lane. And so she's kind of texting back and forth with basically Jimmy Olsen, kind of filling him in on what's going on and asking questions like, what in the world does a Metro desk editor do? But in the midst of all of that, suddenly these kind of tentacles start emanating through Metropolis. And that's when you switch back over to Hawkman and Absolute Superman. And this is when Clark gets crushed, because at that moment, Superman just says, I'm sorry about that, Hawkman, but something's happening in Metropolis. And he asks him, right, do you see that? What is that thing, right? We have to get over there. But Hawkman minces no words. In fact, he says nothing. He literally just rears back with the wrath of God and sends Superman flying with this mace. And that's only the tip of it, right? Superman asks, like, what in the hell do you think you're doing? And Hawkman just says, teaching you a lesson, boy, one way or another. And Superman asks, right, people down there need our help. Don't you hear them? And Hawkman just says, let them scream, Superman. Let's see if you can save yourself. And that's where Superman just says, all right, you asked for this. And like, fires off his heat vision, and Hawkman literally pummels right through it. Because where Superman tells him, you asked for this, Hawkman's like, yeah, and I'm still asking, right? And he's like, is that it? Microwave eyes? That's the best you have. He's like, you're not fighting peacemakers anymore, champ. You're gonna need more than some fancy cape to save your ass. So he's just crushing this guy. Superman goes in for a punch. Hawkman counters, hits him with the mace. He says, pathetic. I guess you figured you're so strong, you don't have to learn how to actually throw a punch. And he says, sure, you're fast, but fast and clumsy is still clumsy. And he says, it looks like you learned how to fight from watching TV. I learned from killing Germans and the Viet Cong and commie super spies. Without me, you'll be dead in a week, Superman. And he says, now tell me the truth. You were never in a single fight before you got these powers, were you? And Superman just tells him, you're right, but I've got these powers now, and just clocks this guy and just sends him flying through a parking structure. And so at that point, Hawkman and Superman come face to face with this critter that's out there. And Hawkman is like, what in the name of all that's holy is that? And Superman's like, I told you, either help me save Metropolis or stay out of my way, Hawkman. And he says, this is the only fight that matters, because this is Project Parasite, feeding on the life energy of everything around him. And Jesus, if this guy is not the definition of nightmare fuel, you guys know I love nightmare fuel, this guy is the definition of it, right? This is a monster if there ever was one. And so at that point, we switch over to Missouri, because lest we forget, Brainiac went to go see Lex Luthor. And so at that point, the conversation picks up between the two of them, right? This is a generous offer, and I do appreciate you coming all the way out here, but I'm afraid I just don't understand. I mean, why me? And he asks, why come all this way and make such a push for a guy who owns a small town gas station and coaches Little League football? The only game we won was because the other team had mono. And he says, are you sure you have the right Lex Luthor? And that's where Brainiac, in disguise, says, oh, indeed, Mr. Luthor, you're exactly the man I need for this project. After extensive research, your name has come up as the absolute perfect candidate. But Lex asks him, right, this project, you say it's classified, so do you work for the government? And Brainiac tells him, I've shaken the hands of 10 presidents, 11 if you count the one who slapped me, but now I've gone into business for myself. And this project, all I can tell you is that its focus will be on one very special individual. They call him Superman. And the response of Lex, right, I don't really know who that is. I don't really care much for the news. I'd rather be working in the yard than looking at my phone. I know there's a lot of problems out there these days, but here, well, everything's a slice of pie, right? And that's where his kids, Lena and Alex, come running outside. Hey, mom says she's ready to cut the cake. Are you ready to come in here? Right? And he says, yeah, tell your mom that I'll be right there. And so at that point, they get up, and Brainiac tells him, Mr. Luthor, let me remind you that money is no object. If my offer does not seem fair, simply add as many zeros to it as you would like. I assure you, I will pay whatever the price to be in the Lex Luthor business. And that's where Lex just tells him, right, that's awfully flattering. But at the end of the day, no, right? I cannot take that offer. I have everything I need right here. I'm the luckiest man in the world, which is the worst thing he could have said. Because at that point, he says, I'm sorry, but I just can't say yes to a job that's going to take me away from my family. I'm gonna have to decline. And so Brainiac tells him, okay, fine, right? And then he continues on and he says, don't feel like you have to rush off though, right? You're welcome to stay for a slice of cake, mister. And he's like, but then I remembered, I don't really have your name. And that's where Brainiac tells him, oh, I'm not gonna be leaving, right? If this is everything that you feel like you need in order to be happy, then I'm gonna kill everybody and take it away. Because he tells him, you're not who I thought you were, Lex Luthor. You're nothing like the man of unquenchable ambition you are meant to be. I have seen beyond this universe. I've seen a Luthor who raised himself up to throttle gods with his own hands, who carved his name in blood across the stars. This pitiful, hollow shell of a version seems to lack the necessary motivation, but that's okay, because my name is Brainiac, and I'm told I can be quite motivating. Let's get started, because this dude turns his arms into chainsaws and starts getting to work on everyone. But how much do you want to bet this Lex Luthor is not what he appears to be. There's something else going on with this guy. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.